Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. The American president has joined the presidents of Russia and Ukraine and the British Prime Minister for a winter swim in a convivial ice hole. After their quick, invigorating plunge, they will enjoy a congenial round of vodka and deliberate affairs of state. Now, this is but one of the wildly surreal scenes that animate The President's Last Love, a novel by Andrey Kurkov that examines 40 years of Ukraine's past, present, and future through a combination of irony, black humor, and post-Soviet realism. In the process, the book becomes both a commentary on political absurdity and an oddly provocative inquiry into what is to be valued and preserved in the life of an individual. My guest is Andrey Kurkov, author of The President's Last Love. Andrey, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you. Hello.
I'm going to hold up your book, which I enjoyed reading, as a teaser because it's going to be hard to get in the States yet, but I hope very soon. This is the translation that we got from England. And as I say, I enjoyed it immensely. Actually, I enjoyed it, Andrey, because I used to live in Latin America, Brazil in particular. And while I was there, the world was going crazy over what they called magical realism, the school of literature that was so important in Latin America. But Brazilians and Latins themselves just took it as a matter of course because they felt that surrealism or magical realism was the best way of depicting the reality. And when I read your book, I said, well, this irony, this black humor, this surrealism, and this, for an artist like Andrey, this is perhaps your idea of the best way to understand the reality of Ukraine. Would that be right?
Well, I think so, yes, because especially black humor and surrealism, because I would say the border between realism and surrealism in Ukraine lies somewhere else than in the West. So that's why actually for Western readers, sometimes it's very difficult to read completely realistic novels from ex-Soviet Union because they also sound surreal.
Right, right.
So I'm sure some of the normal things which are realistic in Ukraine are perceived here as surrealism also.
Exactly, well said. You know, it's on the book jacket, on the back cover, and I've also heard other people speak of you and your style of writing, and I can understand where they get this, that they see a lot of Dostoevsky or Gogol in the type of, which is obviously a great compliment to you, writing that you do. But I must say that the man that I kept in mind as I read this was Bulgakov and The Master and Margarita. I kept hearing that kind of echo. Who are your influences? Who do you look up
well,
to?
I love Bulgakov and Gogol, of course, but I wouldn't call Bulgakov mine. I mean, probably subconsciously I am under his influence because he is also from Kiev, and I was crazy about his works when they were first published in the end of 70s. But I think my main influences are Kafka, Andrei Platonov, who is probably less known here. He's a great Russian writer from 1920s and 30s with proletariat background. And Knut Gamsun, the Norwegian saga teller.
That's wonderful. Yeah, Hamsun I know very well. Kafka, everyone knows. The second one again was Platonov?
Andrei Platonov.
I'd like to look him up. Has it been translated?
He's translated by Robert Chandler, published by Harville Press in London.
Right, right. Well, I'll certainly make a point of looking that up. Having read this book of yours, Andrey, and I look forward to reading many others, I must say, I'm going to be looking for them. I'm wondering about the state of Ukrainian literature outside of you. I mean, how active it is, what's going on there. It's not something we hear much of on this side of the world.
Well, it's very young because unlike Russia, I mean, Ukraine had a very long period of literary vacuum. In 1991, when Ukraine became independent, 1,700 writers, unions, members were forgotten because they wrote only about good communists and collective farms. And at that time, actually, the translated into Russian books by Chase, by Dick Francis came on the market and took it over.
Right.
And what we have now, we have about 30 young Ukrainian writers who are 20, 25 years old, mostly ladies, who write the kind of literature which already is not popular in the States. I mean, it's sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Oh, really?
It's completely apolitical. Yes, some of the writers, like the most actually famous among them is Irena Karpa, whose novels probably could be considered pornographic in some countries. But I mean, they are read like diaries, private diaries of a person who is having failure after failure in her private life.
Right.
But at the same time, she's a rock singer. She is a TV presenter on MTV Ukraine. And she was photographed for Playboy Ukrainian edition.
So that tells me a lot about her right there.
But I mean, this is the extreme case of this show business literature.
Show business literature.
Yeah, but I mean, the other are also, I mean, they are either very active in journalism, in glossy magazines, or on TV. But at the same time, these young people are very popular among students, and they can get a crowd of 300-400 students when they're giving a reading. This
is fascinating to me because all of it is fascinating. The most interesting thing, though, is use the word apolitical, that this generation is not writing the kind of novel that you have written, really.
No. I think
why is that? I mean, it sounds very hedonistic, the sorts of things they're concerned with.
I think subconsciously, consciously, many people think that actually politics in Ukraine is a very dirty business. And the writers were used always. In the Soviet time, they were used as propaganda, masters of propaganda for the Communist Party, and then they wanted to serve the idea of nationalism, and they wanted to be used and to be paid. They were used but not paid, so they resigned, many. And the new generation just thinks that politics stink, and to be associated with politics is bad. But also, I think in a way what they are doing by their non-political, apolitical writings, they distract also young students from politics. So they show that the real values are somewhere else, in the nightclubs, on discos, in the...
Well, you know, I mean, I'm obviously showing my age, but I think there may be a price to pay for that in the future. It reminds me, Bernard Malamud, I don't know if you know of him, one of the great American writers, who's died recently, not too many years ago. But he wrote a book called The Fixer about Russia, which his family had immigrated from. And the whole gist of the novel was people ignore politics at their own peril. Yeah. You know, you have to pay attention to something.
I know, yeah, but we have sort of my generation of writers, not very sort of large generation, and the writers there also don't write about contemporary politics. And they are all sort of infected with some factor of nostalgia after Austrian-Hungarian Empire.
Wow.
And there are 4 or 5 very good writers who are writing actually about past of Ukraine, philosophical stuff, semi-essays, semi-fiction, also nothing to do with today's Ukraine, nothing to do with Ukrainian politics. And I think probably what unites both generations is cynicism towards Ukrainian politics, although it was different in 2004 during the Orange Revolution.
Well, let me just, I was going to ask you this question anyway. First of all, it sounds to me you've got a generation of writers looking back, you know, sort of leapfrogging back into the Austro-Hungarian grandeur, and then this younger crowd of writers who's having nothing to do with any of that stuff and just focusing on sex, drugs, and rock and roll, as you put it. But what I'm wondering is, and also because of the style your book is written in, with its heavy emphasis on irony, is cynicism really the major problem of Ukrainian politics and society now? I mean, is it sort of what people feeling nothing's going to make a difference with these people, these politicians?
Well, so far it doesn't make a difference. Even, I mean, you can find a lot of criticism of the politicians and a lot of their wrongdoings described in the newspapers, and nobody takes any notice. And they actually behave like they are not accountable. Many of the politicians behave like this. I mean, probably the only one who is trying to behave in a proper way is President Yushchenko. But at the same time, I mean, he's rather passive, so he decided to give an active role to his head of this administration, who has rather grey past and has a long experience of intrigues. And I mean, what we have now in politics, it's actually even more interesting. You cannot describe it in literature because you need skills of a very professional thrillers writer.
Right. Yeah, that's well said.
And I just thought that, I mean, I wouldn't be capable at the moment to describe what is happening in the Ukrainian politics.
Well, if I had to place my bet on anyone, I'd place my bet on you. I think you could probably come up with it. You know, and speaking of what you can come up with, let's go back into your past a little bit, because it's fascinating to me. And tell me if this is true or not, because it's charming. And if it's not true, we'll still use it because it's charming. There's a story that you began writing at age 7. You had 3 hamsters. Pet hamsters. 2 of them died. So you write a story about the 3rd one, about his loneliness. Is that true? Yeah.
And then he fell down from the 5th floor, from the balcony, and died also.
Oh, God. But you, from that point, that early in your life, you had this interest in writing, recording what you saw, and of course from a given perspective.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And my second piece of poetry was about Lenin because I knew that he was also dead.
Here's something about your past that is funny in a way, but it's really admirable. When I held up this book at the start of this program, as I always do, you know, people see it, as they should, as something to read and as an evidence of your success as a writer. But at one point in your life, again, I hope this is true, just for the sake of the story, you had to deal with 500 rejections of your first? More than that?
More than this, yeah.
I want to...
I keep them.
You do keep them now?
Yes.
You should. It's kind of a personal trophy in a way. So you had 500 rejections. Then I think you had to publish your own first book and sell it by hand in kiosks and other places. So, I mean, with that kind of background and persistence, what's the advice you give to someone who really feels he or she should write?
Well, I mean, one should understand that writing a book or trying to become a writer is a great risk. It's a lottery. And if you're a genius, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will win in this lottery. Mm-hmm. So persistence is the main thing, actually, because it took me 18 years of sending all around the world manuscripts and synopsises in English and in Russian.
You sent them internationally.
Yeah. First, I smuggled them out through my Polish friends, and actually, he had lots of unpleasant adventures because of me. He was arrested by Polish Secret Service, and then the information came to Ukraine, and then I was asked about my parcel business. But anyway, I mean, if somebody feels strongly that he has a message or he has a story, and he thinks that, and he has a moral support of people around him who read, he should go on. Right?
I think that. Well, you certainly proved your point. I'm sure glad you did. I think you're one of these people who had to be a writer. You know, you were born to be a writer. So good.
Which means I was born lazy. I thought actually, I wanted to become a writer first at some point when I was a teenager, because the Soviet writers didn't go to work, didn't go to offices. They could just write and 5 sentences about the book, if they are members of the Writers' Union, go to the publishing house, get the advanced payment, and then they drink coffee, they write, they drink coffee, they write, they drink cognac. So, I mean, at some point I had this idea, but actually I should tell you now that probably it's much more work than one can expect, and my wife forced me to sign a contract that if she finds me on Sunday writing, I have to pay $1,000.
Good for her. Good for her, and good for you too that you both worked it out this way. You know, one of the chief strengths of this book, The President's Last Love, is its protagonist, Sergey Pavlovich Bunin, and we follow him in this book over the course of about 40 years. You know, as a teenager, he's kind of a wayward teenager and very charming, but a little misguided maybe, and he becomes a bureaucrat with a catering firm, and then he eventually emerges as president of Ukraine. And so all of this, we go back and forth in his life, and that raises questions too. But one of the first questions in this depiction of this man who becomes president of Ukraine is your view of politicians, because it seems to me like it's a dark view. It's a view where power seems accompanied by misery and loneliness all the time. What is your view of Ukraine's politicians in particular?
Well, I mean, I wrote this book because I thought that why I never saw Ukrainian presidents smiling and happy on TV or anywhere, and why all Ukrainian politicians look so miserable, and all the time they are fighting with each other, although it is a theater mostly because they are friends and they are partners in businesses. Yeah, and I decided to write this book on behalf of the first person, like trying to leave the role of the politician, and my character for me, I mean, Sergey Pavlovich Bunin is a positive character because I was writing the book in the times of Kuchma, just before the Orange Revolution, and I thought that, well, this Bunin is much better than Kuchma. He is less corrupt. He is probably, well, I mean, he doesn't care about the country, but he doesn't care less than Kuchma did.
Right. You know, he's the fellow who is his chief assistant, Nikolai Lvovich. He's very interesting too. He can't be trusted, I don't think. Is that right? Of
course not. And you know, the first buyer of this book was Vladimir Garbulin, who was at that time advisor to Yushchenko. And
what did he say about it?
And he came up later to me and he said, "How do you know so many details from the administration's life?"
It's fascinating. Another fascinating thing, Andrey, is this. I mentioned just a moment ago, the book goes back and forth. So we go back to 1975. We see him as a youth, a teenager, and it goes all the way through to 2016, which is yet to, really appear in the world, but it happens to him. But that very use of the past and the present, I want you to speak about that, because there's a beautiful phrase, I just wrote it down for myself, about, and I quote, birds sounding differently in the past. I mean, what does the memory mean to you? What's the use of the past for?
Well, actually, memories of the past makes the reality stable, more stable, I think. And since I'm describing the events which will take place, or taking place in 2011, 12, 13, 16, so I mean the real and realistically described past actually justifies the future, description of the future, which is not very realistic sometimes.
Right.
And these jumps in the structure, I think I was trying to create some kind of holographic picture of the life of 3 generations, actually, of 60 years, 40 years.
Well, as a reader, that worked well for me, because it made me, I didn't use the word holograph, but now I will use it, because that's the way I think of my own life, that I am constantly in past, present, and future, and you're trying to make sense of all of them. There's a very interesting and beautiful sentence in this book also. I could quote many of them, but this one just leapt out at me. Life goes on and must be properly enjoyed for one's own well-being and the happiness of others. It's just beautiful. I don't know what it sounds like in Ukrainian, but it's one of these things you really remember. To the extent that the story would have a moral, you would want people to remember things. Would that be one of them?
Yeah. And there is actually another thing. There is politics in the book, and there are love stories, and they are sort of counter-projected.
Right.
So you have to, in Ukraine, to choose between politics and love.
And the choice is yours.
Yes, choice is yours. If you are in politics, you are not loved, and you are losing your ability to love people and to love partners.
Right,
So.
right. But there's something else I would add. You've got politics and love and the choice to be made. The book does another thing that I thought was very beautiful. It has a lot of pathos, because to be, I don't want to give parts of it away, but children are not born. They're born and they lose them at birth. Svetlana, was it? Is?
Yeah.
And those were some of the most moving chapters, because the pain of that, the loss, the way it changed the relationship between the two of them. So life does have choices, but it also has pain that's going to come, and how you deal with it.
And pain makes people human, in fact. Even politicians.
Even politicians. Speaking of politicians and pain and other things, you wrote this book in Russian.
Yeah.
Why did you write it in Russian? Is that
Well,
a
it's
problem?
my mother tongue. I was born in Leningrad. I grew up in Kiev. Kiev was Russian language speaking city. I speak Ukrainian with no accent, and I write essays in Ukrainian and in English and German. But my main language for literature is Russian.
Has that created any problems for you with the Ukrainian intelligentsia?
Well, it did create a lot of problems before. It creates less problems now, since my books are translated in 32 languages, and I'm sort of representing Ukraine in different countries. So I think I'm pardoned for my
is the word.
Russian language. But actually, there are officially 14 million Russian language speakers in Ukraine.
Wow.
And there is an old tradition of Russian language literature about Ukraine. So I mean, I don't think that Russian language is monopolized by Russia. It's Russophony like Francophony. So I mean, the language is much wider cultural thing than just instrument of one country.
One of the reasons you might have been pardoned, in addition to writing so well and there being so many Russian speakers, is that there's something about this book and its timing that turned out to be kind of almost, well, to use the phrase, magical. In the book, Bunin is, of course, under constant threat. There's a very intricate assassination plot underway against him within his own body, in a manner of speaking. This appears just before Viktor Yushchenko is poisoned in Ukraine. And there's an oligarch, Kazimir, I think, in this book, who tries to use energy and control of it as a way to gaining power. And this appears in this book just before the gas crisis comes. So, I mean, what do you have? The gifts of prophecy? Or how did you see this coming?
Well, I think once, if you live in the country, you feel what is happening there, and you can probably foresee subconsciously. I think I was trying actually to foresee consciously what is going to happen, and I mean, it's not so difficult, except for the poisoning of my main character happened in the book 6 months before the poisoning of Yushchenko. And as a result, I was invited by 2 generals from the Secret Service to have coffee and cognac and a conversation in one of the restaurants.
Really?
Yes, and they are sort of, one of them asked me in a very friendly manner, would I think that my book could be used as the scenario for the poisoning, which I said, I don't think people who actually professionally poison other people read fiction. They read professional literature. But in fact, the phase of poisoning started in Russia in 1999-98.
Right.
So, I mean, it was just the last phase of criminalized political battle. Vladimir Putin is actually one of the characters in this book.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it was one of the reasons why my book were out of Russian bookshops for 18 months also.
Speaking of the characters in this book, in addition to Sergey, there's his brother, Dima, who's a very interesting person to me. Because, there's a parallel story where he marries Svetlana's sister, and their child is born, Lisa's born alive and healthy and such. And Dima has, at least is described as having mental problems. But he seemed to me in many ways an interesting character, not just because of that aspect, but well, you should answer the question, but he shows courage. There's something about him that's very, he's like the mirror image of Sergey in so many ways.
Well, you know, I mean, officially in the book he is schizophrenic. Officially, the dissidents in the Soviet time were called schizophrenics, and they were diagnosed by KGB psychologists and psychiatrists. So, in fact, actually, he is very normal personality who just doesn't accept this life.
Right.
And he finds refuge in his own sort of self, and everybody is happy to accept him as a schizophrenic. But I mean, he's more happy in a way until
the end.
Until the end, yes, than the main character.
I thought more happy and more heroic. I mean, he does certain things that I thought were really gutsy. Speaking of gutsy and interesting, the women are very interesting, all of them in this book. I mean, there's quite a number, but they've got real dimension to them. I mean, they make you at least very hopeful that this represents a strength in Ukrainian women.
Well, I think the society exists only thanks to women. Not only Ukrainian, Russian also, because I always said that we have a matriarchate, a secret matriarchate society where actually the men are pretending to rule the country. They rule the economy maybe, yes, but I mean they have now Tymoshenko, I don't know what to do with her.
Yes, Yulia Tymoshenko.
Yeah, and she's an example. I mean, she's an extreme example of matriarchate in Ukraine. But generally on the family level, families survive only thanks to women, because they put everything in order. Men are either drinking or lazy or just watching TV. I don't know how it, probably in America you can say also that the women are very active, I mean, more active sometimes than men.
I would say that definitely. And speaking of America, I can't help asking you this question. You've been on tour to American universities. This is the most political year here. Do you think we should, I mean, what kind of treatment would you give our politics? Does it deserve a kind of ironic treatment of its own kind? Does it look mad to you, or what does it look like to you?
I mean, I haven't seen the campaigning, actually. I've seen a lot of posters.
Right now.
I was stopped in Stanford, I think, by a journalist, radio journalist, looking for somebody to comment on the elections, and nobody wanted to comment. It was interesting because, I mean, if a journalist comes with a microphone in Kyiv on the street to somebody, everybody will just go around and try to say something. And here, I probably it's not typical that people.
That's odd to me. I mean, here in Washington, you would get a crowd doing that, but they held back.
But I have a feeling that actually the elections this time, the campaign is not as hyper as it used to be.
Well, we shall see.
Well, on the TV, yes. On the TV, it is very present, and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Clinton himself.
You know, I think you have a point, because I think it's a good point. And in fact, I just read this today, and I think it too, that the American electorate is taking it in a much more serious and sober way than we used to in the past. I think that's absolutely correct.
Yeah, there is less show, I would say.
Yeah, and more substance, we can hope. Speaking of what people are doing about elections and other things and about this book, How would you want readers to understand the question this raises for them? For example, let me pose this: that this book, on a very personal level, struck me as an invitation to rethink my own life, or to think about what has been important and unimportant, how I've used memory, relationships with other people. That above and beyond the political questions, that would be at least one of the things to get from it.
Well, I think the main idea, actually, the main message is to understand and define your own human values, personal values, and then see how other values can collaborate with your human values. And actually, if you appreciate your life given to you by the God, you should decide what to do with it. I mean, it's up to you. You can waste it in politics, or you can waste it also in the family. But generally, I mean, the main thing is to find yourself, to define yourself, and to find a harmony. Because if there is no harmony, you will be torturing yourself, looking for something that doesn't exist and that lacks love, partner, job, if you are doing the job you don't like.
That's beautiful. I mean, quite frankly, I love that answer. It takes me back to that sentence I quoted earlier: life goes on and must be properly enjoyed for one's own well-being and the happiness of others. And you've added here the need to appreciate the life you have and to make it as harmonious as possible. For all these reasons, it's a fine book, Andrey Kurkov.
Thank you very much.
I'm glad we met, and I hope we meet again.
With pleasure.
Thank you. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Once again, Andrey, thoroughly enjoyed it.
Next week on Dialogue.
Produced. And I saw this firsthand, that international donors, very well-meaning, say, okay, fine, you want X, Y, and Z done, here is the money, we will do it for you. However, you know, that X, Y, and Z, which the international donors fund to do, is going to be completely meaningless if the government has not done A, B, and C. For example,
The Art of Conversation, Dialogue at the Woodrow Wilson Center features 20 years of dialogue, distributed by the Johns Hopkins University Press, www.press.jhu.edu.